Good morning. I'm Nicole Dibbins-Sadaka, and for almost 2 years now, I've had the honor and the pleasure of serving as the Executive Vice President of Freedom House. Thank you so much to everyone for taking the time to join us for the launch of our new report entitled Examining How Civic Mobilizations Grow and Thrive in Authoritarian Contexts. This report digs into 21 international case studies to figure out which factors most help or hinder the growth of pro-democracy movements. From Tehran to Beijing, from Havana to Hong Kong, around the world, we are seeing peaceful protest movements put authoritarian regimes on notice. And this report is so timely and is an essential contribution to a growing dialogue about how civic mobilizations can grow and naturally how they can succeed in achieving their goals when facing some of the longest odds in authoritarian countries. For those of you who might not be familiar with us, Freedom House is the longest running international democracy organization in the US. Not only does Freedom House produce cutting edge research and analysis of political rights and civil liberties around the world, like the one you'll hear about today, and work to mobilize governments and other organizations to advance democratic values through policies and actions, but we also provide direct support to human rights activists, to pro-democracy movements, and civil society organizations on the ground, because we know that at the end of the day, those courageous individuals and organizations are the ultimate change makers. This morning's program will start with an overview of the key findings from the report's co-authors and co-principal investigators, Laura Adams, who is the Monitoring, Evaluation, and Learning Director at PACT, and Natalia Farrat, who is a researcher at Freedom House, as well as a research associate at the Wisner Center for Emerging Democracies at the University of Michigan. Following their presentation, Freedom House's Nate Schenken will moderate a panel featuring Laura and Natalia, as well as Freedom House's Kuskandi Abdul-Shafi and Horizon Initiative's Jonathan Pinkney. After the panel, all of you will have the opportunity to submit questions to our panelists. Thank you again to everyone whose hard work has brought this report to fruition, and to all of you who have taken the time out of your busy pre-holiday period to be with us today. The findings in this report, and indeed the work of the democracy activists that this report examines, are extraordinarily important to global freedom, peace, and prosperity. With that, I'll hand it over to Laura Adams and Natalia Farrat to present the findings of examining how civic mobilizations grow and thrive in authoritarian contexts. Thank you both for your great work.
And thank you, Nicole, for the introduction and for your support of this project. All right, so I'm very pleased to share with you the findings of what has been about a 3-year-long effort to get information about how civic mobilizations grow in authoritarian contexts. And I would like to preview our findings by talking through with you, reviewing the events that happened in Belarus in 2020. So in the summer of 2020, many of us were likely glued to our Twitter feeds as we watched a surprisingly competitive presidential election unfold and the largest public protests that Belarus had ever seen. The new presidential candidates and the regime's repression of them mobilized millions of people willing to risk arrest or worse to defend their values. And yet those same values had underpinned broad support of Lukashenko's regime until recently. What changed? What changed was who was espousing those values and how those values were used to frame the regime's own shortcomings. The 3 original presidential candidates did not represent the established political opposition. They came from careers in IT and finance. Their supporters saw them as doers, not talkers, who had made their own careers in the private sector, but had also contributed to projects that benefited society. They gained popularity for talking in new ways about the state's waning ability to deliver on its promises of security and stability. The messages of their campaigns were about civic values, solidarity, agency, dignity, and fairness. values that Lukashenko had also engaged in the early days of his political career. The first regime crackdown on these would-be candidates came after their supporters were already mobilized and organized. IT professionals, artists, pro-democracy activists, creative class professionals, they were all angered by the regime's blatant violation of its own election laws by not allowing candidates to register and arresting them. The candidates' followers on social media and the networks of self-help organizations that had formed during the COVID-19 pandemic used social media and messaging apps to mobilize others in their communities to vote for the new candidate, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. The second regime crackdown came after the election results were falsified, but the repression backfired again. The violence outraged many of those who had not yet been mobilized, fueling even larger protests involving labor unions and pensioners. Sustained repression over many months and the exile of movement leaders led to the abatement of public acts of resistance by the end of 2020. Countries like Belarus can be stable autocracies for decades until they're not. Often civic movements in autocracies seem to come out of nowhere. But we conducted this research in order to determine if there are patterns across recent cases that could give us a clue about why and how civic mobilizations grow, even under very repressive conditions. To find these patterns, we compared 21 mobilizations over the last decade. 16 of these mobilizations grew beyond what anyone expected. That is, they scaled up. 5 of the mobilizations, the ones in gray, did not scale up. We also explored the 4 of the successful cases, the ones in blue, in greater depth. We looked at Belarus, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Vietnam in much more detail to understand who the main actors were, what were the key factors leading to mobilization growth, and the sequences of events that led to that scaling up. We concluded that there are 2 main factors that are associated with mobilization growth in many of these cases. In 7 of these cases, including Belarus, these 2 factors were both present. The first factor, as illustrated in the Belarus case, is who the leaders are. Leaders of successful movements in our data often came from outside established opposition groups. They were entrepreneurs, artists, environmentalists, members of youth movements. And the second factor is how these new actors frame their messages. In movements that grew, the messaging shows that the government has not lived up to its ideals and also presents an alternative vision of the future that speaks to the same societal values the regime invokes. In order to explain in more detail what these 2 factors were, I'm going to turn the presentation over to my colleague, Natalia.
Thank you, Laura. So let's now look into these 2 factors that Laura mentioned in more detail, the new leaders and the framings that the movements used. So why is it that the new leaders are usually more successful than the established opposition in building the movement, even though they act in the same repressive environment? So in the Belarus case that Laura just described, opposition parties existed, but it was the new candidates with 0 electoral experience who managed to build the movement. So the mechanism that we are seeing across cases, okay, that's the wrong button. The mechanism that we're seeing across cases that likely causes this effect has to do with the history of political contestation. In most cases that we studied, there was a moment in history, usually at the time of transition from the previous regime, when political space was more open and there was a genuine contestation between different political players for state power. At that moment in time, the party of the elite group that later became the regime, the current regime, won over the other parties, at least partially because it was genuinely more popular than their opponents. And after the regime consolidation, the parties that lost that battle, as well as the dissidents such as human rights defenders, sometimes were eliminated completely and sometimes continued to exist in the increasingly repressive environment. Over time, these actors became what we call the entrenched opposition. So there are several reasons why it is difficult for the entrenched opposition to build a movement. Usually it is difficult for them to change their agenda, which remains out of touch with grassroots concerns. More often than not, this entrenched opposition also is comprised of the older generation for which it's difficult to adapt to social media use, to other innovations in our lives. Also, the entrenched opposition is usually the first target for repression, including preemptive repression. And if they also are in any way associated with foreign funding, that discredits them in the eyes of the public because they're viewed as seeking personal gain, and any connection to them is seen as toxic. In contrast, the new leaders, they're usually more flexible and innovative, both with their agendas and with their tactics, and they adapt them quickly to social demands. They're less likely to be repressed right away. And also they don't have that baggage from the past, and they don't have the already discredited reputation. To be fair, the old opposition sometimes played a role in the movements that scaled up, but it only happened when they managed to form new coalitions, and usually with these new social movements. So now let me provide a few examples. Ethiopia. Ethiopia used to have a regime dominated by the Tigray ethnic group. And the old opposition to the regime among the Oromo ethnic group was an underground armed resistance organization called the Oromo Liberation Front. The goal of this organization was secession from Ethiopia and the formation of an independent Oromia state. The OLF was, of course, heavily repressed. It was prohibited from participating in politics, and it could not provide a channel for the Oromo people to publicly voice any kind of concerns. And the situation did not change until the new generation of the Oromos formed a youth network. They started using new means of communication and began advancing an agenda that better spoke to the needs of the Oromo people. Another example comes from Vietnam. So Vietnam is officially a one-party state, and the political opposition is absent inside the country. In 2016, there was an environmental disaster where a steel plant poisoned waters and killed fish along the ocean coast. The movement that emerged afterwards to demand accountability and compensation was led by new political actors. These actors included Catholic priests that have not been involved in politics before, and the activists of an environmental movement, the Green Tree, that emerged a few years before that. One more example is Russia. In the early 2000s, when Vladimir Putin came to power, he was quite popular, and the old liberal opposition had a lot of political baggage because of the difficult times in Russia in the 90s. So that opposition has never really developed a new agenda. And in addition to being unpopular, it was also systematically deprived from airtime in major media and had little hope to build a movement. In the 2010s, however, we witnessed the growth of a new kind of opposition, with Alexei Navalny becoming its leader. These activists experimented with new agendas and were very technologically savvy. And it was them who were behind the 2017 wave of anti-corruption protests, which was the widest protest Russia has seen in decades. So the new activists in all these examples proposed an agenda that was different from the agenda of the old opposition. So let's look now at how exactly different that agenda was. We saw across cases that the most successful opposition agendas did not simply offer an alternative to the regime's agenda. They actively embraced the same values as the regime agenda did. At the same time, they rethought how those values could be served. In other words, these opposition agendas preserved the main cultural framing that the current regime used, but offered a more attractive political alternative that resonated with that cultural framing. And by doing this, they contested the regime on its own terrain and successfully undermined the regime's legitimacy. So for an example, let's again look at Ethiopia. As I mentioned, the old opposition used a secessionist agenda, while the Tigray-dominated government used the federalist framing. According to this federalist framing, Ethiopia was a federalist state where all ethnic groups had equal rights. And this agenda has been advanced through the state-controlled media and taught to children in schools. So what the new generation of Oromos did, they embraced this agenda and turned it against the regime. So instead of saying that Oromia should secede from Ethiopia, they said, yes, Ethiopia should be a federalist state with all ethnic groups having equal rights. Where are our rights? So they started demanding their rights and equal treatment and connected these demands to the people's everyday needs, such as education and economic opportunities. And this proved to be a much better strategy that also created space for other ethnic groups to join the resistance. Another great example of rethinking the regime's framing is the case of Zimbabwe. The mobilization against Mugabe's regime in 2016 began with a viral video. In that video, Pastor Evan Mawarire creatively used the national flag as the symbol of betrayed hopes. Before that, this flag was widely associated with Mugabe's regime. And Mawarire used this core symbol of the regime to suggest a different version of patriotism. A similar example of successful reframing comes from Cuba. In July 2021, there were large protests in Cuba against deteriorating living conditions and lack of food and medicines. And the participants of those July 2021 protests, especially the young ones, they used the slogan Patria y Vida, or Fatherland and Life, which came from a rap song released a few months before the protests. This slogan clearly refers to the old slogan of the Castro regime, Fatherland or Death, Patria o Morte, and it replaces death with life. And if you look at the lyrics of the song that are now on the slide, it explicitly questions the regime's ideology. It asks, what are we fighting for if at the end we cannot feed our families? It also calls out the regime's hypocrisy and lies. So it engages with the cause, with the anti-capitalism and anti-Americanism that legitimizes the Cuban regime, but it turns it around and uses this framework to question the regime's legitimacy. So the two factors that I talked about, the new leaders and the framings that rethinks the regime's framing, increase the chances of a mobilization to grow across the cases that we studied. But besides these two factors, there were a few other ones that also contributed. And these factors are the dynamics of repression, the internet and social media, and the help of diasporas and international organizations. Here, I will only briefly mention why they were important, and we can talk more about these factors in the Q&A if you're interested. So repression dynamics. All movements that we studied were repressed, but the timing of repression was crucial for its effectiveness. Repression was often effective if it was used before the mobilization gained momentum. If the regime tried to repress the movement after it has grown, it often led to a backlash and further growth. The internet and social media mattered because in many mobilization episodes we studied, the ability to spread information quickly, especially videos, was very important for mobilization growth. And this was especially true when the activists managed to stay one step ahead of the regime that was trying to limit the spread of that information. And finally, support from diasporas and international organizations was important both symbolically and in material sense. It was most effective when activists inside and outside of the country used their complementary advantages for the benefit of the movement. On that note, let me turn it over to Laura, who will discuss practitioner implications of our study.
Great. Oops. All right. So Natalia and I are both social scientists, but we very much designed this study to inform practitioners, both donors and organizations like Freedom House, about the findings of our research and to try and inspire ways that we can support nation movements in authoritarian contexts. So our recommendations are the following. The first one is to continue sustained support to professionals. When we think about Freedom House's work, as Nicole mentioned earlier, we work with human rights defenders, and we tend to think of people like lawyers, journalists, activists, policy researchers, there's election monitors, and so on. These people, we found, are not likely to be the leaders of a new social movement. But these movements that emerge in authoritarian contexts very much need the support of professionals with these skills. Support helps these established in-country professionals sustain their work, even in the times where change seems very unlikely. And when change begins to emerge, they are there to support an emergent civic mobilization in ways that new activists without these skills cannot. Our second recommendation is to support cross-border training and network building. Our partners in authoritarian contexts may want us to support them with low-profile, peer-to-peer training or mentorship across borders. We found many cases where this would be this was very useful to study and develop their own set of nonviolent, non-confrontational, and innovative tactics. They learned from movements in other countries and by studying abroad. So supporting these requests to engage in this kind of solidarity and training across borders is likely to be a good investment. We recommend that international organizations use their organizational prestige and their convening power to build cross-cutting civic ties in the countries where they work. We recommend expanding our ideas about who a civic actor is, bringing together our pro-democracy partners with professional organizations, entrepreneurs, environmental movements, student groups, to connect with each other even informally and build those relationships and ties and keep our pro-democracy partners in touch with what these other organizations are doing and thinking. We need to help civic actors stay one step ahead of the regime's technology. Those of us who work on international programs, speaking for myself, are not always the most savvy about digital security. But donors can fund engagement with outside ICT, internet communication technology security experts who know how to stay one step ahead of the regime. We can support our partners' use of communication tools that are not easily monitored or blocked by the government, like satellite phones. And we must adapt our own digital security practices and policies to meet the needs of our local partners. Finally, we have a recommendation about, for donors about being ready for that moment of movement emergence. So if the regime does not crack down immediately, we saw, and if they do not crush the movement in that initial crackdown, that might be the right time to surge support to establish partners in that country. Movement leaders themselves rarely want donor funding, and there's been some good research on this recently. So the target is not the movement leaders themselves that we want to support or surge funding to. Movements, however, will accept in-kind and moral support from local civil society organizations. So we recommend providing both technical and psychosocial support to those partners that can safely receive funding or who can participate in activities outside their home country. If provided at the right time, this surge support could make a difference for the movement overall. So we have a few more recommendations in the report, and we're also happy to discuss this in the Q&A. But right now, I'd like to hand it over to Nate Schenken, who is Freedom House's Senior Director of Research, who will moderate the panel discussion.
Thank you. Thanks, Laura. And thank you, Natalia, for this excellent presentation, for the paper. It's very interesting, and I think we're going to have a very engaging discussion. For the audience members on Zoom, please use the Q&A function while we're speaking during this part of the discussion, and you can submit your questions there, and we'll take a look, and we'll pass them on to the authors. As Nicole said, joining us for this part of the conversation are Kuskandi Abdul-Shafi, who's a regional advisor for the Africa program at Freedom House, and Jonathan Pinkney, Director of Applied Research at the Horizons Project and a lecturer in political science at George Washington. We're going to start with Kuskandi, so let's start with you. If you want to turn on your camera, we'll get you in there. And I know you were involved, Kuskandi, with the report in different ways in terms of conception as well as execution. Just tell us, what are the most important points you took away from the research? And do you have any questions that you wanted to push on Laura and Natalia now that it is published and finalized?
Thank you, Ned, and thank you everyone who really worked very tirelessly for this research. Natalie, Laura, and Zach, and all the team members really appreciate all the work. Thank you everyone who joined us today for this very monumental research launch. It's really great for us too. So I think for me, I want to see what is the most important key points for the research in a way that to be very beneficial and useful for praxis part of our work. And I think two things I see as very key factors. One is that the traditional way of resistance building, where you have an oppositions and known NGOs and groups trying to work to resist a change regime, is very difficult right now than before. One thing that makes it difficult is that age of authoritarian regime, the first thing the first 5 years does is to really develop an immune against those institutions. Either those are entrenched opposition or civil society. And this is very clear in Sudan case, for instance. The first 2 years of the regime dismissed more than 21,000 civil servants. Those are the key people who are working into public sector and the head of unions, from the universities, hospitals, teachers, and financial sectors. The second is change the law, for instance, from the broad-based unions to institution-based unions, which make it easy to control. And I think to make a change or to see strategic change is that you have to be very innovative into finding the blind spot of the regime. And in Sudan case was the resistance movement, which was actually existed through all these years and survived within the students' institutions in the universities. And if you read the report, particularly in Sudan, it shows so much details on how that strategic engagement and, using the inherited history of the resistance in the country, plus the skills and training that again have been contributed into building the movement that's successfully being able to mobilize. The second thing that I think what I see in a praxis-wise, which is, this research informs us, is sometimes when we do programs in a country, particularly in the authoritarian context, as an organization, INGOs and our donors, we really want to do something fast and see the result. Show me the result. In 3 months, you can't see the results. In 1 year, you can't see the result. If we train 400, 500 people in 2013, for instance, in Sudan, as another partners, and the result was 2018, you see the gap of the time. For the donors, that might be was a failure of the project. which I think strategic long-term planning is really good. And it also allows that ownership to be processes, and people has to be, in the driving seat of planning. And, this skills has to be tailored to fit. And that is why I was very successful into compiling, which is like how the issues being framed, which is happen to be key. And I think the one thing that I would say when the movement to take off, which is I in the Sudan case, but in also several other cases that were successful, you will see throughout the time after two factors. I feel like the research, some additional research need to be done on how much, particularly in a context like Sudan and others, where the politics are so much connected to ethnic, racial division, how difficult it is for the marginalized group to change regime. In Sudan case, wouldn't have happened if the people, mostly the regime sees these are close to me, are being able to stand out and create a solidarity. And how youth movement of being able to actually mobilize into very core area where all regime people are there, including their families, and how this was, implemented. The second thing is, the safe space, convening, providing an area, safe space where this group from the different areas, and this, I saw this throughout in the last 10 or 12 years of my work into youth building and youth resistant building, how safe space and that deep conversation of what we want to make a change for really help into framing the movement massive, but also create something that I might say revolutionary oxytocin, where people create a social whole effect of, having defined it a clear who is our enemy, who is our friend. And when revolution reaches that level, it is very difficult for any authoritarian to be able to silence. And that is what led, after the 2018, that the revolution movement was being able to really create a cross-border consensus and building, and everyone just said, that's good, but must fall. That is, end of anything. So everyone agree on that and being able to buy into that simple message. But that was very artistic and related to socio-cultural idea of everyone having have to stay on line of bread, a very long line to get bread, very long line to get fuel, very long line to get anything, even to get money in the bank, cash, your own money. And that was so much related to everyone's daily life. And it was easy, then this has to go. I think other factors, for instance, especially in Sudan case, something that would really need additional exploration is the international sanction, particularly the indictment of the President Bashir and few leaders as the key. That plays somehow a role into within the regime to say, because we have this guy who is internationally demanded, we can't move anywhere, sanctions can't be moved, and economy can't be fixed. And people's claim are legitimate. Maybe if we change them and we remove these people, maybe there will be a window for us to continue to keep our, power and wealth and be able to find some ways to merge within the movement and survive. And that was, created self-doubt within the regime or inability to really introduce a clear, concise alternative to the people, for people to buy in, not to go to the revolution. And so those are kind of a bit of things that I think in the research doesn't address, but they maybe is in Sudan case, but in the broader wise, maybe need some more digging in. I want to stop here and back to you, Nick.
Yeah, thank you, Kuskandi. It's wonderful comments. I think we'll collect from Jonathan and then hear from Laura and Natalia in response. One thing I wanted to pick up on that just there at the end that you mentioned, this idea of sanctions on an individual leader, of course, is very different from the sanctioning strategy in many other cases that I think are even included, where the sanctions are more focused on other members of the elite with the idea to provide room for that leader to make decisions. So that's a very interesting, different dynamic that you've identified. Let me hand it over to Jonathan. And yes, your remarks and any questions you'd love to ask of the presenters.
Great. Thank you so much, Nate. And thanks so much, Laura and Natalia, for this really amazing report. And it's been a pleasure to be part of the consultative group on this report for quite some time now, and the many excellent conversations that we've had about it. And yeah, what a joy to see such an amazing product coming out of this at the end. I really highly recommend to all of you, if you haven't read the report yet, to go out and read it. I really appreciate the way in which kind of the core lessons that Laura and Natalia brought up here are, sort of very clearly laid out in the report, interweaved with some, very compelling short case studies. So it was a joy to read, and it's great to be able to have the chance to chat about it. So I had kind of three core points that stood out to me from the report that I wanted to bring up here, as well as then three particular questions that maybe we can discuss a little bit more. So the first point that really stood out to me is this question, that is, this lesson that comes out over and over again in the scholarship on social movements, of how important it is, how critical it is really for groups to bridge across difference, and how critical a variety of approaches to change really is. I appreciated that we see this scale up coming from new actors, from actors we might not expect, but that this doesn't mean that the entrenched opposition, as you call it, is irrelevant, that they don't have anything to contribute. Again, I think, Laura, you brought this up really well in your recommendation at the end. We need those usual suspects, those typical opposition figures, to provide that technical expertise and that help once kind of the new actors have been able to spark that initial scale up. And so this critical need for, kind of diversity of approaches being a core strength for any kind of social movement success. This is something that I've focused on in my own research in the past with Charles Butcher and Jessica Braithwaite, and something that I think is a lesson that just can't be reiterated enough. Another thing that really stood out to me here is, again, just another reminder of the crucial need for localization, and for international practitioners and donors to not just connect with the usual suspects who speak the language of global civil society, but to people who are deeply connected to the grassroots. Again, this is, you bring this up over and over again in the report. The people who are best able to speak to the needs of the average person in these authoritarian contexts are rarely the people who are best able to talk to folks who are from international NGOs. And so how can we make sure that we are building those bridges to people who may not be able to write up a budget and a grant proposal in the way that an international organization might like it. And third, I think I really appreciate the way that this report recognizes authoritarian regimes not just as sort of oppressors who sit on top of societies, but as complex political structures with their own internal logic and their own sources of authority and legitimacy. Our efforts to promote freedom and democracy are going to fall flat if we don't recognize that authoritarian regimes exist for a reason, and they don't just, violence is a key part of them, but they don't just exist through violence. They exist through particular legitimizing frames that support their position in society. And so understanding that and kind of being able to flip those frames is really, really crucial if success is going to be achieved. So yes, kind of three things from the report that stood out to me, three particular questions. I wonder to what degree the two factors that you've brought up here can be boiled down to simply a kind of strategic, innovative, and flexible approach to mobilization. Over and over again, as I was reading the report, I thought about Marshall Ganz's excellent book on social movements, Why David Sometimes Wins, that brings up, how can kind of actors that you might not expect to have the capacity actually bring about change? And he comes back over and over again to the need for innovation, the need for strategic thinking. And so I'd be curious to hear, are these kind of new social movement leaders, is it that they are better able to engage in kind of innovation and strategic thinking, or is there more to it there, like about their positioning in society? And I think related to that, is it possible for the entrenched opposition to be more strategic as well? If could we see sort of more success from those figures if there were ways to increase kind of the strategic and innovative thinking for them? Second, the role of the internet is something that, again, you bring up in the report, but I think is really hovering in the background for a lot of it. Both, because you have this particular focus on scale shift of how sort of low-level mobilization goes to higher-level mobilization, but not as much on how that low-level mobilization first emerges or on how the higher-level mobilization then translates into success. And I think kind of the internet and social media may play conflicting roles at both that very early stage and that later stage, as compared to the kind of the scale shift role that you're focusing on. Again, I think about Niels Weidmann's book on the internet and political protest in autocracies, where his research shows high degrees of internet connectivity make protests less likely to emerge, but once they emerge, they're more likely to spread. Again, I think for many of the reasons that you bring up here. And then I think about, kind of at that second stage, I think about Zeynep Tufekci's work on her book, Twitter and Tear Gas, being kind of the best example of this, on saying, yes, kind of social media has made it easier to have big protests, but it means that movements aren't building the infrastructure that they need to sustain those protests over time, which is leading to declining success. So yeah, I'd be curious to hear kind of your thoughts on how, on how sort of your findings on the role of the internet and social media connects to sort of this broader research. And then third and finally, so this point about kind of flipping the authoritarian frame being a key factor for scale shift was something that was really compelling to me, and I kept thinking about, and I wanted to push you a little bit on it, because so many of the the examples that you brought up in your presentation, and many of them that come up in the report, are sort of they're positive. The authoritarian regime is framing itself in kind of terms that, from a perspective of universal human rights, we might be on board with. In a general sense, they are just kind of instantiating that in an authoritarian regime. But of course, when I think about the legitimizing frames of many authoritarian regimes, Vladimir Putin's Russia comes to mind, where a key part of the framing is this, this sort of family values framing that is really antithetical to women's rights, to LGBTQ rights. And so I'm curious about how you think about this. How can movements do this frame flipping when the authoritarian regime's frame is kind of deeply embedded in ideas that are antithetical to democracy and human rights? How does that, did you come across cases where that was, where that dynamic was going on, and how much you think about that? So yeah, so those are kind of the main things that stood out to me. Just wanted to say again, thanks again for the opportunity to read the report, and I'm looking forward to continuing to discuss it.
Wonderful. Thanks for those very specific and concrete questions, Jonathan. And I'm gratified because the third question was my question, so I feel really good about myself right now. Let's take 10 minutes, Laura and Natalia, to try to answer these, because I think we have a lot of really great questions coming in from the audience, and I want to leave time to respond to others. So yeah, go right ahead.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me speak first, maybe, and pick the questions that I want to answer, and then I'll leave everything else to Laura. So Kuskondi, well, first, thanks both to Kuskondi and Jonathan. They're really, really thoughtful comments, and we actually, we kind of agree with all of them, and it's like a long conversation we can have about all of them, honestly. So I'll just quickly jump into some of the most important points. Kuskondi, I think you're absolutely right that it's really difficult for marginalized groups to challenge the situation, and that the divisions that exist in society, such as, ethnic divisions, religious divisions, they often play a crucial role in how society is structured, how politics is structured, and how the movements can be built. So one thing that we noticed in societies that are especially divided across ethnic or religious lines is that there is a specific type of framing that actually resonates with people and that has the potential for building a unified movement. And that framing is the framing about power sharing. In some cases, we saw that back sometime, in history, there was like because those societies are so divided, they also just they must have some practice of negotiation between different groups, between different parties, and that negotiation and some kind of arrangement of power sharing of how do we live together if we like really dislike each other. It usually exists, and usually it appeals to people that we should talk to each other, we should figure something out. We probably won't be together, won't never become one group, but we should share power in some way. So when this kind of power sharing agreement is in place, sometimes it's the constitution, sometimes it's some kind of agreement, maybe after a genocidal war or something like that. Then when one party intends to violate it or violates it, that is definitely the moment and the reason for people to rise up from different groups. So, and sometimes even from the group that, the current regime belongs to, they also value this power sharing agreement that brings some kind of peace, some kind of stability. Violation of that, agreement often is at the core of the framing of those movements in those societies. Okay, so Jonathan's questions about the entrenched opposition, can it be more strategically more innovative? Well, theoretically it can, but what we found is that this new framing should also be delivered by people with appropriate backgrounds. So you cannot just take this framing and attach it to the old opposition and say like, okay, go, nobody's going to believe them. So in the case of Belarus, for example, these three new candidates, or especially Viktor Babaryka, for example, who was a banker and philanthropist, right? So the vision of the new Belarus that he communicated, maybe not even so much through his public speaking, because the campaign was like so short, but through his actions, right? This is not something that I can imagine the opposition parties communicate and be convincing. So it's not only about the framing, it's also about your background. And most of the time, it's not something the opposition can just strategically change. That's your life history. So that's why they definitely, even in the case of Belarus and other cases, we saw the old opposition just being more politically savvy. They understand how politics works versus the new candidates often just don't. And they talk to each other, they seek advice, and oftentimes the old opposition understands they don't have the appropriate background and they have all this baggage. So they talk to each other, and the new candidates seek advice. And this is the opportunity to join forces and to use those, complementary advantages of both groups. So the role of internet at different stages, I think you're absolutely right. We are focusing on that stage when a small mobilization becomes a big one. And we initially thought to maybe study how they emerge. It proved to be really difficult methodologically. So I would be really curious to actually read the study that does that, and especially on the role of internet. But I totally agree that these scaling up is just the first stage. So we should not think that if the mobilization scaled up, that means it succeeds. No, it's just one necessary condition for success, because no mobilization that didn't scale up ever succeeded, right? But at the same time, after it scaled up, of course, the presence of more durable structures is very important. And that actually speaks to someone else mentioned, so that it's someone to Kuscondi talked about donors' expectations, maximalist expectations. They want the result right away. And what we found is that exactly that just doesn't happen. There is a learning curve. There is a gradual process of movement, of building those more permanent, like more durable structures, let's say, than just, a viral video that goes out on internet. So, and that process, it goes from one unsuccessful mobilization to another unsuccessful mobilization, maybe to another one, and eventually, that learning brings some kind of result, some success. So, and finally, I will just quickly finish about reframing and whether we are kind of just like picking positive examples. Well, first on Putin's family values. Well, I do study Russian politics, and I can speak that those family values are really shallow. They do not correspond to real practices in Russian society. So that particular, framing, I do not believe it is something that is very difficult to change, and it's something embedded, just like fundamentally embedded. But what could be reframed is the quest for collective security. So, I mean, collective security is something that people can understand. There is nothing bad per se about, the need to be secure as a group, right? But you can suggest a different idea of how you get there, right? You don't get there by attacking another country. You don't get there by, invading another country and killing a lot of innocent people. And like, that's not how you ensure collective security. There are some other ways to do that. And this, if there is an appealing way, a good way to speak to that collective security, to invoke the emotions associated with that, right? That could be potentially a reframing. And, there is, when we were talking about reframing, we kind of thought that, of course, the using the same values in a bad way, of course it's possible. Everyone knows it's possible. What we were trying to say is that, well, don't miss that opportunity to imagine that the same exact needs that the authoritarian regime is now using for its own purposes can be served in different ways. And that kind of framing has a lot more potential to resonate with people versus something that is completely dismissive of those needs and values. Because usually people's values, they're not about negative things. They're usually somewhat positive. You don't value things that don't bring you security, prosperity, some kind of good thing, just good life, search for happiness. So, and I think in authoritarian regimes, which you completely right, they do not exist only because of violence. It's absolutely impossible. So it's very important to really understand what is it that legitimizes the regime and try to work creatively with that. And Laura, please add more to what I said.
I think you did a fantastic job. I think I'll turn it back to Nate to field some questions from the audience.
Great, thank you. And yes, thank you. I think you did do a fantastic job. I think we'll come back to this question in a moment as well, in a different way, and maybe we'll get Laura's position on it also. I just wanted to use the moderator's privilege to make one comment, not a question, which is that I think, really good research also helps you see things in a new way. And for me, one of the things this helped me reflect on was actually the American case, the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s, which was led by new leaders, new entrepreneurs who built and scaled up very rapidly a social movement, but also with the help of established, somewhat discredited semi-opposition, especially from the pacifist and socialist movements, people like Bayard Rustin, who's of course connected to Freedom House's history closely. And so, I think that it's a very interesting way of thinking about examples that exist well beyond, the internet, well beyond the current day. Let me turn to these questions because we do have some really great ones and I want to get time. Sorry. I'm going to move on to the second one here that we have first, and I may come back to the first one in a moment. This was a question about Iran, which I know is, of course, going to be on a lot of people's minds. And so one of our viewers asked if you could comment, the researchers, on the framing of woman, life, freedom in Iran. That's become the protest slogan, and whether that is a reimagining, whether you see that as a reimagining of the regime's ideals or values in the ways that you have discussed in your research.
Okay, so I think in some ways, especially again, as it speaks to the security and well-being and the role of the regime in guaranteeing that security and well-being for the population, it is definitely some reframing of that. Regimes like the Iranian regime, they have what social scientists call the social contract with the population. Basically, when the regime is guaranteeing some, at least minimal level of economic well-being, of security, it's just like a safety network, basically, for the people, in exchange for recognizing the legitimacy of this regime and supporting, or at least not opposing, this regime. And so that kind of in contrast to the situation that I mentioned in my response to Kuskondi, when I was talking about societies that were divided along ethnic lines, along, religious lines. Societies like Iran don't really have a lot of internal divisions along any kinds of lines. They are more unitary in this sense. And that's where the regime cannot really, say like, oh, we are having this power sharing agreement. There are no really different parties to share the power. So that's where the regimes are usually using the framing of the social contract. We are the leaders, the fathers of the nation, and we know what the people want, what they need. We are wise, and we're leading this nation. So when you show that the regime is actually not providing security and stability in that situation, that definitely undermines the legitimacy that this regime built. If you show that, well, it is because of the regime that this young woman died, that is definitely undermining the core, like to a degree, it's undermining the core of the legitimacy of the Iranian regime. So I can see it as at least partial reframing and speaking to that core regime legitimacy. I don't know how strong it's going to be, honestly, how well it speaks to different maybe groups in Iranian society, which remains still like a lot more conservative than Western societies, for example. So I think we're yet to see on how wide those protests are going to go.
Great. Well, let's continue. We have plenty of questions, so lots more to talk about. Let me raise one. That previous one was by an anonymous asker, which is why I didn't give the name. This one is by Denise Bayer, who asks, says that protest and civic mobilization are very costly personally to those who engage in it in these hard authoritarian contexts. So 2 questions. What are the ethics of supporting these protests if they're ultimately suppressed? And 2, a question about methodology, about why were the cases limited to post-Arab Spring, and particularly seeking a comment on Tunisia, given the developments regarding the self-coup by President Said recently. And I should add, obviously, Natalia and Laura, as the authors, you have the privilege of responding directly on the research, but Jonathan and Kuskondi, please also speak if you have remarks you'd like to make to any of the questions.
Laura, do you want to speak maybe about methodology?
Yeah, just very briefly, there's been a shift because of the Arab Spring in how authoritarian regimes treat protests. So we felt like there was that there's a particular context in which social movements in these countries operate that's different from before the Arab Spring. So that's why we are looking at this particular period, because there was authoritarian learning taking place around the world. Do you want me to also talk about the human rights, ethics?
Sure. I have stuff to say, but you can go ahead.
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, I would just say that, that in terms of donors and implementers, there is a duty of care, but ultimately social movements decide what they want, and our partners decide what they want and ask for what they want. And I think that our role is to serve them. So we talk at Freedom House and elsewhere about not to do no harm because our partners are already undertaking harm, but to do no more harm and to take the appropriate precautions from our end to uphold the duty of care. So that would be my answer to that question, and I'll turn it back to Natalia.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's not that the international donors are actually telling people to go on the streets and risk their lives and freedoms. it's people who decide to risk their lives and freedoms, and then there is probably a duty to support them and to make it as safe as possible and as not futile as possible, I guess. So but that idea that it's very risky, it is absolutely true. And that's why I rarely believe that people ever go to the streets just because of some kind of material need. I think for a big movement, you should have something bigger than the life of one person. So like you have a bigger idea, you have a bigger cause for which people are willing to risk their freedom and sometimes lives. So, and I also think that what's the ethical cost of not supporting them? That's another question.
Can I offer just a reflection on this ethics question as well? Because it's one that I've done some work on before. I have written recently an evidence review paper on external support for social movements with Miranda Rivers and Jamie Jackson at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where we this was a major focus of the report. And I think like we really focused on kind of two key things. I mean, the first is exactly what Laura and Natalia were bringing up, this focus on autonomy, on recognizing the costs of not acting as well, that authoritarian regimes are not going to be sort of constrained in the same way. And so we should be thinking about sort of what are our responsibilities in the face of a world where authoritarian regimes are collaborating across borders to suppress human rights and democracy, but also being very aware of our power position and kind of the disproportionate influence that international actors with a lot of resources can have. And so a deep practice of reflexivity when we think about how we engage with activists, social movements, and civil society groups around the world. And then also a real responsibility for rigorous research, that if we are kind of providing support or like providing advice, training, convening, the kinds of recommendations that this report focuses on, we should be really, really sure that they work. Like we should be really, really sure that the kinds of training and sort of support that we're providing are going to be really giving those advantages. And so I think that we have a duty as kind of members of the international community for exactly the kinds of work that Laura and Natalia have been doing in this report, to be like really rigorously reflecting on what's going to be most effective.
Great, thank you. And let's move to another question. I want to package two together, and I'm skipping just a moment ahead, and then we'll come back, which is 2 cases, one from Freedom House's own Vika Tülenova. Hi Vika. And another from someone from Turkey, Cemre Ülker. And so reflecting on 2 different cases, Vika asks specifically about Belarus, which I know you studied in the research, and a question about why, despite the scale, the protests nonetheless failed up to this point. And this speaks perhaps, Natalia, to your comment about necessary but not sufficient. So if you could elaborate on that. And then the other was about Turkey, which I think is going through a period of very difficult autocratization, of course. And there's a huge struggle on the part of the entrenched opposition to find a way to mobilize, to find a way to broaden those circles. I know Turkey is not included in the case study, so I certainly understand if you want to defer on that one. But I thought I would lump them together since I think they speak to some of the same problems about how do you succeed?
Okay, I can definitely speak to the Belarus case because I was doing the in-depth case study as one of the researchers. So we should understand that this report, not only like we only speak about the scale up, right? And we only speak about how little movements grow into bigger movements. There are, of course, a lot of other factors that influence whether the movement achieves its goals. In the case of Belarus, I think a lot of analysts kind of agree that it was support from Putin, support from Russia to Lukashenko that finally kind of tilted the scale that way, because without that support, without the guarantees, some financial guarantees, it is likely that we would start seeing crumbling of the state machine. We already started seeing some defections among the diplomats, among some of the people inside the Belarus establishment, but very few. There were a lot more from rank and file police officers and military officers, right? So there was a moment in that movement when, of course, everyone was hopeful that, well, maybe if Putin decides that, it's easier for him to kind of establish some relationship with with the opposition that comes to power in Belarus, then the movements could have succeeded. But I can see Putin's authoritarian logic. If a movement like that succeeds in Belarus, not in Ukraine, in Belarus, that is a lot more similar to Russia, what it would mean for Russia. In Russia, at the same time, there were huge protests in Khabarovsk, where it's the far east region, where the governor who used to be not very oppositional, but then was elected the governor and started acting as an opposition leader, essentially. And then he was promptly removed and people fled the streets and they were protesting every day for, at least a month. Then, of course, the frequency, reduced. And there was some solidarity between those Khabarovsk protests and Belarus protests. And clearly, you could see how that thing could spread, especially, because it was the pandemic. Navalny was, still, not in prison, like still doing things, and the anti-corruption protests that he staged in 2017 were only, 2 to 3 years before that. So it was dangerous for Putin, and he supported Lukashenko. And I think that is what decided finally the movement. And I know definitely less about Turkey. I don't know, Laura, do you know more about Turkey?
I do know more about Turkey, yeah. I would say that the situation in Turkey is not unlike a lot of other contexts where you have various activists and opposition groups who have developed along different ideological lines and who have been tainted by the regime, with smear campaigns, either corruption, sometimes it's exposing like sexual exposés, sometimes it's simply these are foreign agents, right? This is a really common situation where the regime can successfully further divide the opposition, but in countries like Turkey with a history of political diversity, there's also ideological differences and as well as ethnic differences that can divide these groups. And I think when we're looking at situations like that, if I were, advising these groups, what might overcome that, I think it has to do with, there's a couple of different things that these groups could think about. One is thinking about making sure that youth are part of their movement, part of their organization, that youth come into this with more of a clean slate and can kind of get out of these boxes that the regime and past political histories have put around these organizations. And the other is to look outside of politics, to look at environment, to look at arts and culture, and find issues that can unite these different groups and bring about this new framing that can help them at least temporarily overcome these historical differences and unite them around something that resonates with the broader population. And that's not always easy to do. And these kinds of coalitions do not always hold together or produce, meaningful democratic change in the long run. But if we're just talking about the focus of our research, which is sort of building a movement, that is the advice that I would share with groups in countries like Turkey.
Thank you. Excellent answers. Thanks. Next one, and we're going to be running out of time soon, so I apologize in advance if we don't get to all questions. But I do want to ask this one about two questions from Saria Sok. One on the surge support recommendation for donors, and which mentions this seems directly related to cross-border network building. So please share your thoughts on sequencing and balancing of how and when to apply the main 5 recommendations, if you can. And then the second question, which I'm very interested in, very keen on, is this question about the role of diaspora and international organizations. So how should practitioners reconsider the role of a quote unquote external international group?
Laura, do you want to take the one for about donors?
Yeah. So the question of like, how do we integrate these different recommendations? How do we think about practically implementing them? I think we need to just think more about that. I think we will continue to work on this and trying to think through further recommendations, and hopefully with Saria's help, we will be looking at ways to workshop some of these ideas in real world situations. And yeah, so I'm afraid I have to like defer to the future Laura to answer that question.
Yeah, and on diaspora, I think our research is kind of clear on what to do with diasporas. I think donors should encourage them to build connections with activists inside the country, because sometimes what we see is that diasporas are disconnected from activists inside the country, and they think they have their own vision for the country, they have their own agenda, and this agenda is better, and like all these kinds of things. But nothing is going to happen until you actually build a movement inside the country. Things are not going to, change is not going to come from abroad. So in the cases where diasporas usually, you know, connected to the activists inside the country, maybe through like ethnic identity, like some kind of, you know, connection, feeling of belonging to the same group. When they have that and they start actually using their resources and possibilities complementarity. So, you know, diasporas are in free countries. They can be the voice of that movement. They don't have to hide. They can be the face. Versus the activists inside the country, they have access to people on the ground, but they cannot be public. Usually it's just really dangerous. When you work together, when you supply, like diaspora supply, let's say, the means of communications, but at the same time, you know, they develop TV channel that beams onto the country and, you know, spreads the information. And then that information is picked up by the activists on the ground and maybe spread through more informal networks and other means of communications. That's what works. So connections between people inside and outside of the country are crucial, I believe.
Yeah, go ahead, Kuskandi. And I think, if I may, we're coming up to time. So Kuskandi, your remarks, and then I think anyone who has something final to say, please, and then we'll wrap up.
Thank you, Ned. I think just to get back to framing, for instance, the Iranian Revolution and also the diaspora, just to connect these two cases with also in what happens in the with the diaspora dynamics into the country. So it is sometimes very difficult for somebody from outside to understand what it means a girl is standing in a crowd with no scarf on the head in Tehran. It is just something that everyone in the West or somewhere will not be able to understand how challenging that it is. Because it is an entire regime. It's a challenge to an entire moral system and regime that is enshrined for over, 50, 100 years. Books, college, syllabus, grandma at home, your uncles, your cousins. It is just an entire system that a girl grow in until college, until graduation, and challenging that this is not. And there is this collective fear, with the religious faith that maybe God will get angry, will put us in hell, all of us, because of this act. And how that, is framing that is like, here I am, and nothing happened. And how diaspora actually play a role into, how that means for a girl in Tehran with seeing her cousin or aunties somewhere in the West, wearing bikini or short and just in the TikTok. And why God didn't destroy those countries. It's just, it gives us outside comparative perspective. And I think it is really very key. The diaspora actually help a lot into outside actors understanding what actually real means. And I think, for instance, in Sudan case, it's not only, if I one day we went to the protest, and then we're seeing here in Washington around 15,000 people in the National Mall protesting. The three people who spoke, I think 3 of them were trained in Sudan as an nonviolent movement. We just would consider it as, attrition, that actually the work that you do in the country, they actually go and continue that work. The recent diaspora that migrated recent, and the second generation diaspora, they connect and create a new search of very strong power into being a message of the revolution. There's certain information, for instance, that person in Sudan, if they pause, they will be in danger immediately. But external, diaspora can pause that and be able to share and convey those messages. And people inside can access in different avenues to do, because they are not under immediate arrest. So I think there is different aspect, but also, I think there is a very strong role with diaspora, not only conveying what actually inside happens, but also conveying what outside looks to inside people. And that really increases the demand for change and makes, ability to take a very difficult questions to question a moral regime like Iran very easy for women inside Iran. Back to you.
Thank you. Thanks for those remarks. I mean, certainly, I think the role of diaspora is something that a lot of donors are looking at, a lot of civil society groups are looking at and thinking about, particularly as regimes become more capable in reaching across borders for transnational repression actions, also as these movements globalize and are able to connect more readily. I want to thank everyone for joining us in the audience. I want to thank the panel, and I especially want to thank the researchers, Natalia and Laura, and congratulations on a really excellent report. I hope everyone has a chance to sit down and read it. There's even more inside of it than we could summarize here today. And I know that it's going to continue to pay off in work and in recommendations that we'll be playing out ourselves at Freedom House and with our partners all over. So thank you, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Nate, and everyone.
Thank you, Nate.